So we want to talk about electrolytes. So an electrolyte is a molecule that dissociates or breaks down in water to give a positive and a negative ion. Okay, so things like sodium chloride. Okay, so it comes apart in water and you get sodium, which is a cation, and chloride, which is an anion. Okay, so I want you to remember that, whoops, shoot, that was my finger, sorry. I want you to remember cations are positively charged, right? Anions are negatively charged. Okay, so they're both types of ions. Things that are electrolytes are typically salts, acids, so like hydrochloric acid is HCl. So with that comes apart, you'll have hydrogen ions and chloride ion. Okay, so both are charged. Bases, so an example of a base is sodium hydroxide. That comes apart, you'd have sodium and hydroxide. Okay, and then there are some negatively charged proteins too that also function as electrolytes. So an electrolyte, if you had chemistry, you would remember that I think you do a lab where you take different substances and you put the light bulb in them, and if the light bulb lights up, it's an electrolyte. So it actually will conduct a current. Okay, so it'll conduct electricity, I guess, is a way to look at it. So like glucose won't. Glucose is not an electrolyte, but these things are. Okay, now the way that these are measured are in milliequivalents per liter. So this is essentially equal to the amount of electrical charges in 1 liter of solution. Okay, now electrolytes are important in your body because they're important components of metabolism. Okay, so you need them for to be, I'm sorry, I'm trying to do two things at one time. They're important as cofactors, okay, or coenzymes. Okay, they're definitely important in cell membrane potentials. Okay, so they're going to be what makes your neurons fire or your muscles fire. Let's see, what else? Do I have something else written under there that you can't see? I don't know why it's cutting it off. That's weird. Okay, and they're also going to help regulate the osmolarity, and this you'll have printed out, the osmolarity of body fluids. Okay, so and when they do that, they're going to help regulate water balance. Okay, so whether things are hypertonic or hypotonic. So these are their three main functions. So metabolism, cell membrane potential, osmolarity of the body fluids. Okay. All right. Now we're going to talk about them individually. We're going to talk about the individual electrolytes, whether they're hypertonic or hypertonic, what happens. Okay, so go here. So first thing I want to remind you, right, if something is hypo, right, it's low, too low. And if something is hyper, right, it's high. So you need to remember those prefixes, hyper and hypo. Okay, so if we talk about sodium, the reason sodium is so important in your body is it is a major component in establishing your membrane potentials. Okay, so it's going to be found in the extracellular fluid. Okay, so it accounts for 90 to 95% of the ECF. Okay, so it's outside the cell. It's important for the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so active transport, sodium-potassium pump, you have to have sodium in order for it to work. Sodium-potassium pump is important for glucose transport, and it also generates heat as a byproduct. Okay, so it helps keep your body warm. Okay, sodium in your body, it's usually present as sodium chloride, which we're all familiar with that, or sodium bicarbonate. Okay, now sodium bicarbonate is going to be really, so this should be a little 3, but for some reason it gets messed up when we put it on this app. So sodium bicarbonate has a really important role. It buffers the pH of the extracellular fluid. Okay, so it's going to buffer that. Okay, now if we look at this, this is the way the book has it has it organized, and I'm trying to use these pictures because it does summarize it. Okay, so if you look at this, okay, these balances are set up like, where are you getting it? Where's it coming from? So intake, how's it leaving the body? So what's the output? And then how's it regulated? So that's kind of how these images are broken down, and it summarizes it all pretty well. Okay, so normally the sodium balance is between 135 to 135 milliequivalents per liter. I am not going to make you memorize those. Different books use different numbers, so when you get to your program, you'll learn what they tell you. I'm not going to make you memorize them. I want you to know in general where it's located, though, like whether it's in the cell or out of the cell. Okay, so most of the time we get plenty of sodium in our diet. We only need a half a gram a day. Okay, but generally we get 3 to 7 grams in our diet, so it's kind of crazy. We get such an overload. Okay, so usually what our goal is we want to excrete sodium, so we want to get rid of as much of it as we can. So one of the most important roles of the kidneys is excreting the excess sodium. Okay, so we're going to lose it in our urine, our feces, and our sweat. So I'm going to write important role of kidneys. Okay, so if you have too much, it's a problem. Okay, now there's 3 hormones that are concerned with sodium regulation. Okay, so aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, and atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay, so aldosterone, it's the salt retaining hormone. So when we retain salt, we'll retain water. So that's going to maintain the sodium level and maintain the sodium level in the blood plasma. Okay, antidiuretic hormone, its main function is to retain water. What it's going to do is it's going to have us hang on to water, hold on to water, and when we do that, that'll decrease the amount of sodium, the concentration of the sodium in the plasma, so it decreases the osmolarity. Okay, now atrial natriuretic peptide, it's going to increase excretion of salt or sodium and water. Okay, now those are the 3 main things, how it's regulated. We're going to go back and we'll talk about the hormones and lay them out in a couple minutes. Okay, so sodium imbalances, these are actually pretty common. Well, no, I have common here and I have rare. Okay, so sodium imbalances, I think in your book now it says it's common, but our body is actually really good at getting rid of sodium. So our kidneys are very good at that. Okay, so the first one I have is hypernatremia. Okay, so I want you to be able to recognize that. Okay, so you'd have a greater than 145 milliequivalents per liter. So it's caused by dehydration, so you're losing a lot of water. It can also be caused by diabetes insipidus. So in diabetes insipidus, you don't have enough antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so you end up losing too much water, and that makes your blood more concentrated. And sometimes, if they give you a saline IV, the saline IVs, hypotonic is 0.9%. So this is normal saline, it's 0.9%. and that can cause you to get too much sodium on board. Okay, so if you're hypernatremic, okay, you can hold on to water, so you get edema. It can cause high blood pressure, and it can cause edema. Okay, now hyponatremia is when it's too low, and it could be caused by drinking too much water or having too much antidiuretic hormone, diuretic abuse. So sometimes people, when they want to be thin, or they're bodybuilding, they take diuretics to, like water pills, to flush out fluids, or severe diarrhea. Okay, so what happens with it is the cells will actually swell and blood pressure will drop. Okay, now potassium. Okay, so remember potassium is K. Okay, so it's the most abundant cation of the intracellular fluid, so it's what's inside. Okay, so it determines intracellular osmolarity. It's going to be important with the membrane potentials, and it's another important component of the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, now potassium homeostasis. Potassium is one of the trickiest ones, okay, because it's the most dangerous of electrolytes. Okay, so it's the one that can kill you. Okay, so they actually use potassium chloride in lethal injections. Okay, but a lot of companies aren't making that anymore. So there's lots of, lots of drama and lots of interesting things, because there are prisons that are doing lethal injections are having to go out of the U.S. And so then the drugs aren't necessarily approved by the FDA, and there's just all sorts of drama around it. Okay, so if you get an increase in potassium too fast, it can cause a heart attack. Okay, so it causes cardiac arrest. Okay, so if we look, so here's the milliequivalents, how much we have. Okay, most of the time we're getting it from our diet. Okay, so it's not hard to get. It's not usually a big deal. And we're going to lose it in urine, feces, and sweat. So once again, okay, it can be regulated by aldosterone. Okay, so we'll talk about aldosterone. Okay, now potassium shifts can cause problems. So let's talk about potassium shifts. Okay, so the potassium ions, so potassium distribution is dependent upon potassium levels, hydrogen ion levels, and insulin. Okay, so if we look at this picture, okay, so if we maintain normal potassium levels where everything is okay, we're in equilibrium. Okay, if too much potassium enters, the potassium will actually enter the cells. Okay, it'll go into the cells. If the blood potassium decreases, it's going to exit. So we're going to try to keep it in homeostasis. That's the goal. It's going to move from higher to low concentration. Okay, I'm trying to see what page this is on in your book. Okay, it's on page 998. Okay, now, if we can maintain the blood pH, okay, everything will stay in homeostasis. However, we want the charges to be equal. So if the blood hydrogen ions increase, okay, if we become acidic, then the hydrogen enters the cells and the potassium exits the cells. Okay, if the hydrogen ion decreases, the hydrogen ions leave the cells and the potassium enters the cells. So it can cause, if the hydrogen ions are shifting, it'll cause a shift in the potassium ions. Okay, so if the pH changes too much, okay, it can cause a change in potassium ions that could cause a heart attack. The cells could become, could be stimulated. Okay, now insulin has another effect. Okay, so typically what happens is we maintain potassium following a meal. Okay, but if insulin increases, it's going to increase the movement of glucose and potassium into the cell. So if there's too much insulin, we'll get too much potassium into the cell. And I hope that all makes sense. Okay, now, potassium imbalances. Okay, so potassium imbalances are the most lethal. Okay, and so hyperkalemia would be too much potassium. So the effects depend on how fast the imbalance occurs. Okay, so it could be caused by low aldosterone, renal failure, okay, acidosis, decreased insulin, okay, cell trauma from a crush injury or a burn or transfusion reaction. Okay, so crush injury. So if someone is in an accident, like say a construction accident, and a heavy piece of equipment falls on them, the cells are crushed. What happens is when they lift the piece of machinery off, okay, normally there's lots of potassium inside the cells. If they lift the piece of machinery that's crushing them off, okay, the potassium is released too fast into the interstitial fluid. Okay, so it's released too fast. Okay, that can happen when someone is burned, or it could happen if you accidentally get old blood and the blood cells are lysed, or you get the wrong blood type and the blood cells lyse. Okay, then too much potassium is being released into the bloodstream. Okay, and it causes a problem. What it does is if it rises fast, the extracellular potassium makes nerves and muscle cells abnormally excitable. Okay, so it makes them super, like, hyperpolarized. They're ready to go. It's not going to take much to stimulate them. Okay, so it starts out, it can cause nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, okay, tingling, numbness. But the worst part is it can cause irregular heartbeat if it's bad enough. Okay, so it can cause an irregular heartbeat, and that's what makes it lethal. Okay, now the opposite happens if there's a slow rise. Okay, so the slow rise, what it does is it actually inactivates the voltage-gated sodium channels. Okay, and the muscle cells become less excitable. Okay, so it might not cause any effect. Okay, or it could cause, if it goes on for a while, it could cause fatigue, it could cause the muscles to be weak. Okay, so this is not deadly like this is. Okay, and I think this kind of explains it better than that last slide I tried to show you. So this is good. Okay, now page 999 has a table that summarizes everything. Okay, and I really just want you to pick some big things, and I have some example questions to show you. Okay, now hypokalemia. Okay, so we're too low. Okay, so you could be sweating, you could be vomiting, diarrhea, laxatives, so lots of feces, or you have too much insulin. Okay, or you're in acidosis. What happens is it's the same as the slow. So you become hyper or hypopolarized. So the nerve and muscle cells become less excitable. Okay, and it can cause muscle weakness, nausea, which is spelled wrong, decreased muscle tone. Okay, heart rate can become irregular, and the diaphragm might not work. So this is bad. Okay. Okay, now this is just to show you hyper and hypokalemia, okay, and what's happening. Okay, so normally, right, we're at normokalemia and we have a resting membrane potential. Okay, and so we have more potassium ions inside than we have outside. Okay, now if we have hyperkalemia, okay, so we have more potassium ions on the inside, okay, what will happen is we'll have, the cells will become hyperpolarized, so they're partially depolarized, they're like ready to go, ready to be stimulated, so it starts going up sooner than it should, so the cells are more excitable. Okay, now if that goes slowly, okay, it causes the same symptoms as this, okay, so these are equal. Okay, now if you have less, if we're hypokalemic, okay, we're going to have more potassium leaving the cell. The cells are less excitable, and it's harder to get things stimulated. Okay, now chloride ions. Okay, so it's the most abundant anion in the extracellular fluid. Okay, so it functions in hydrochloric acid, so it's what is a main component of the stomach acid, and it's also going to be important when we talk about respiration and this chloride shift in red blood cells, which we haven't got there yet because we're doing it in opposite order. Okay, so here's the amount that's normally there. We get it in our diet, we lose it in sweat and urine. Okay, so it's strongly attracted to sodium and potassium and calcium. Okay, so it wants to make salt. Okay, it wants to do that. So it wants to be that. So it passively follows those. Okay, so it's going to follow them usually wherever they go. Okay, now the primary homeostasis of chloride is achieved as a result of sodium homeostasis. So if your sodium's okay, your chloride's okay. Usually we don't have a problem with chloride or sodium. Those are, usually it's not a big. Okay, now chloride imbalances, so there can be hyperchloremia. Okay, so it's because you get too much in your diet. It could be the same thing, so IV saline, hyperaldosterone. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily cause any symptoms. It's not a big deal. Sometimes it could cause irregular breathing and it could make you thirsty. Hypochloremia, okay, is caused by heavy sweating, so you're vomiting, you're losing HCl, or say they have to do GI suction, so maybe somebody overdoses and they have to put an NG tube in and they're sucking out what's in there and you're not getting any, the hydrochloric acid's not staying in there. Okay, so it could be no symptoms. It could cause tetany. Okay, so tetany means your muscles are going to contract too much. Hyperactive reflexes, so everything is going too fast. It could cause seizure, it could cause coma, it could cause respiratory arrest. But we're not, it doesn't happen that often. Okay, now calcium. So if you think about calcium, okay, so calcium is abundant in our bone and our teeth. So we don't let it float freely in our cells. So it's normally stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So remember the sarcoplasmic reticulum of your muscle cells. So it's normally stored attached to something because we don't want it to calcify. We don't want it to calcify when it's in the cell. That would be bad. Okay, so it's an important component of muscle contraction. It's an important component of the second messenger system, and it's also essential for blood clotting. Okay, now, it's regulated by 3 hormones. Okay, so parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, and then calcitonin. Calcitonin is mainly in children. It regulates it mainly in children. So these are going to control whether we deposit bone or whether the bone is reabsorbed, and whether we're excreting calcium through the intestines or through the feces or through the urine. Typically, right, I just tried to tell you this, cells maintain a very low amount of calcium inside of them. Okay, so imbalances. So hypercalcemia and hypocalcemia. Okay, so hypercalcemia, it can be caused by hyperparathyroidism or hypothyroidism. It also could be caused in case, like if you have cancer and your bone is breaking down, or you have renal failure and you're not getting the calcium out in your urine, or you eat a ton of something like Tums, which has got a whole bunch of calcium in it. Okay, so if you have too much calcium, okay, it inhibits depolarization. Okay, so your cells don't want to fire. Okay, so it can cause muscle weakness, slowed reflexes, irregular heartbeat, and it could cause the soft tissue to start to calcify, which is not good. You don't want it to you don't want calcification anywhere but in your bone. Okay, now hypocalcemia could be that you're not getting enough in your diet, okay, or you're not getting enough sunlight to convert it. It could be caused by diarrhea, pregnancy. When you're pregnant, right, all the calcium's going to go to making the baby's bones, and the mom's bones get depleted if you're not getting enough in your diet. Lactations, milk production, okay, or hypoparathyroidism or hyperthyroidism. Okay, so hypocalcemia is going to cause the cells to be too excitable, okay? So too excitable, abnormally excitable, okay? So it could cause tetanus, which is when the muscles contract and can't relax, laryngospasm, which I'm trying to spell. Okay, and if you larynx spasms, it could inhibit your respiration, and that could cause death. So even some chemotherapy drugs can cause this to happen. So they monitor your electrolyte levels. Okay, now phosphate. Okay, so phosphates are found in the intracellular fluid. Okay, and they're found in there in several different formats. Okay, so there's lots of different. So there's PO4 like this. There's HPO4 2 negative, and then there's H2PO4 negative like that. Okay, so that's what they look like. And I'm not going to make you memorize those. Okay, so phosphate, monohydrogen phosphate, dihydrogen phosphate. Okay, so these are important because they're part of the nucleic acid. They're going to be part of your phospholipid bilayer. They make ATP, any of the CAMPs, GTPs. Okay, so they're going to be important components for metabolic pathways. And another thing that phosphate does is buffer pH, which we'll have to talk about. We'll get there. Okay, now phosphates when we have an imbalance. Okay, so hyperphosphatemia. Okay, so it can be caused by kidney failure. Okay, laxatives, enemas, respiratory acidosis, cell damage. Okay, typically it's asymptomatic. Okay, but it could lead to hypocalcemia because phosphate will bind to calcium. Hypophosphatemia is caused by insufficient intake. You don't get enough in. Hyperparathyroidism or respiratory alkalosis. Okay, and we got to put all the pieces together. So if we don't have enough, we might not be able to make ATP, and then our muscles won't be able to work. Okay, now let's see.